The noon sun hung high over Ravenford Naval Base, bleaching the concrete parade yard in a harsh white glare. Training hours had ended, yet one soldier remained in the open field with a pressure hose slung over his shoulder, spraying down recruits who had stumbled during drills. It was a crude tradition, one meant to toughen them, though everyone knew it was mostly ego, a test of who could endure humiliation without breaking. Sergeant Blake Rowan stood at the center of it, tall, broad, and confident in the authority he believed he carried. He had been stationed at Ravenford 3 years, long enough to know the routines, the shortcuts, and which rules could be bent without consequence. The hose in his hands blasted cold water in a pressurized roar, enough to sting skin and steal breath. Recruits lined the edge of the concrete, their uniforms clinging wet to their trembling bodies, silently praying their turn would not come again. Then she arrived. She moved quietly, no dramatic entrance, no attempt to command attention, a newcomer, shorter than the rest, with dark hair tied neatly under her cap and shoulders held in calm posture. Her uniform was crisp, untouched by dust or sweat or worry. There was nothing visibly remarkable about her presence, yet something in her eyes suggested she saw everything with uncomfortable clarity. Blake noticed her almost immediately. Someone new always drew interest. He scanned her uniform for rank, but there was none. Just the blank insignia of a fresh assignment. To him, that meant fair game, and fair game meant the hazing began now. You, his voice cut through the thick summer air, step forward. The other recruits glanced at one another in discreet horror. They didn't know her name, but they pitied her already. She stepped forward without hesitation, no fear in the motion, just quiet acceptance. Blake smirked. Rookie, huh? No reply, only a steady gaze that didn't challenge, but didn't bow either. He lifted the pressure hose. Let's see how well you handle a welcome. The blast of cold water struck her like a wall. Her cap flew off, hair whipping back. The force staggered her, but she didn't fall. She didn't retreat. She simply planted her feet more firmly, like a tree deciding the wind had no right to move it. Around them, silence stretched. Even the seagulls overhead seemed to pause. Blake increased the pressure. It slammed against her ribs, her shoulders, her throat. Yet her expression didn't change, not defiance, not pride, just stillness, as if she had endured colder storms than this, harsher worlds than this, and this was merely another forgettable moment passing through her life. His amusement began to shift into something else, something unsettled, something like irritation. He stepped closer, narrowing the distance until the spray struck her from only feet away. But she didn't flinch. The recruits watched with awe now, not at Blake's force, but at her quiet, immovable strength. The kind that comes from experience instead of bravado, the kind that made some remember why they joined the service in the first place. Blake's jaw clenched. "What's wrong?" He muttered, more to himself than to her. "You break easy, or you just too stubborn to show it." She finally spoke, voice steady despite the water streaming down her face. "I've been through worse. No anger, no threat, just a simple truth spoken without drama." Her words unsettled him more than shouting ever could. The hose lowered slowly. The water shut off. The yard no longer echoed with the hiss of pressure. The air was still again. The recruits expected her to collapse now that the ordeal was over, to gasp, to cough, to show any sign of discomfort. Instead, she bent down, picked up her cap, and placed it back on her head with gentle precision, like someone caring for something that still mattered. The moment held weight, the kind that lingers. A voice echoed from behind them then, loud and deliberate, carrying an authority that instantly froze Blake's spine. Sergeant Rowan, he turned. An officer in decorated uniform approached, surrounded by silence so complete it felt like a tide pulling the world inward. Every soldier on the yard stood straighter without being told. At her side walked an assistant carrying a sealed document case, embossed with the crest of Naval High Command. The officer's gaze moved past Blake and rested directly on the quiet woman who still stood damp and calm in the open sunlight. "Admiral Cassandra Vale," the officer said with deep respect, "your arrival was to be announced this afternoon, but it seems you've already been introduced." Every recruit went still. Blake's breath stalled in his chest. Admiral, the woman he had sprayed down, humiliated, challenged, was the new highest authority on this base. The quiet rookie was not a rookie at all. She looked at Blake. No hatred, no fury. Only the patient gravity of someone who has seen entire wars start and end. And Blake felt small for the first time in years, not because of rank, because of the kind of strength that cannot be earned through power, only through pain. The courtyard did not breathe for several seconds. The heat seemed to withdraw, the air cooling with the weight of realization. Blake's hands slackened around the hose, fingers trembling slightly. He had seen officers before, commanders, hardened veterans, but nothing in his memory resembled the quiet presence standing in front of him now. Admiral Cassandra Vale, a name spoken in base lore like a rumor, like a shadow that traveled faster than news itself. The kind of leader who had been on the front lines long before promotion ever touched her shoulder. She stood there, rainwater from the hose still dripping from her sleeves, pooling at her boots on the white concrete. Yet she held herself with composure, so complete it seemed beyond human conditioning. It was not arrogance, it was understanding. Understanding of how much she knew, how much she had lived through, how much she could lose and still remain whole. The officer accompanying her cleared her throat, though her voice was softer now, more careful. Admiral Vale's transfer was personally requested by High Command. She assumes operational authority over Ravenford, effective immediately. Blake swallowed. The back of his neck felt hot, as though he stood under a spotlight. The recruits around him stiffened, eyes flicking between him and the Admiral, anticipation simmering like a held breath. Everyone expected punishment, a reprimand, a public correction, something to restore the moral order he had just shattered. But Cassandra did not speak. She simply watched him, and something about the silence was more punishing than any shouted condemnation. Blake forced himself to straighten his posture. His voice, when it finally came, was strained, low. "Admiral, I didn't know." Cassandra lifted one hand, just a small motion. He stopped speaking instantly, the way a child silences when realizing the rules of the world have changed. Her gaze traveled across the courtyard, taking in the recruits, their fatigue, their fear, the unwritten hierarchies that lived within military walls. She saw who deferred to who dominated and who endured. She had seen systems like this on every base in every region, across every conflict she served. Power misuse did not surprise her, it disappointed her. She turned to the officer at her side, clear the yard. Her voice was soft, but there was no questioning it. The recruits dispersed without hesitation, boots scuffing across the gritty ground, bodies tense with the urgency of escape. Soon only Blake remained with her, the hose coiled at his feet like a shed serpent skin. The courtyard was too quiet now. Cassandra stepped forward, close enough that her shadow overlapped his. She did not tower over him physically. Yet her presence, the invisible gravity she carried, made it feel as though he had to look upward just to meet her eyes. "Tell me something, Sergeant," she said, her tone calm. "At what point did this become normal to you?" Her words were not an accusation. They were worse. They were a mirror. Blake's throat tightened. He remembered his first months at Ravenford. He remembered being on the receiving end of the same hose, the same humiliation, the taunts disguised as tradition. He remembered promising himself that when his time came, he would do things differently. He would lead, not torment. Yet somewhere between then and now, he had become exactly what he once resented, not because he was cruel, but because cruelty had been the easiest way to prove he belonged. His jaw tightened as the truth sank in with an uncomfortable heaviness. Cassandra did not break the silence that followed. She allowed him the space to confront the realization himself, to let it settle inside him where it could not be ignored. "You hold authority here," she said finally. "You will continue to hold it, but authority is not the right to harm. It is the responsibility not to." The words were not dramatic. They were not meant to wound. They were simply true, and truth could cut from within. Blake lowered his eyes. "Yes, Admiral." Her expression softened just a fraction. Not forgiveness, not approval, simply recognition that acknowledgement was the first step toward change. "Report to Command Hall tonight at 1900, she said. "There is a briefing. You will be there." He nodded. She turned to leave. But before she did, she looked back at him once more, this time not as a superior officer, but as someone who understood exactly how difficult it was to unlearn the parts of oneself shaped by survival. "Strength is not measured by how much power you wield over the weak," she said quietly. "It is measured by what you do when no one stands above you to keep you accountable." Then she walked away, her steps quiet across the blistering pavement. Blake stood alone in the sun, the hose still at his feet, the weight of her words heavier than the rifle he carried. For the first time in years, he did not feel like the strongest man on the field. He felt like a man who had forgotten who he once wanted to be. The evening sun lowered behind the western walls of Ravenford Base, throwing long shadows across the training fields. The world softened in color, but tension lingered in the corridors as word of the courtyard incident spread quietly, carried in half-whispered conversations between bunks, passing glances in the mess hall, and the tense silence of those who had witnessed it directly. Blake Rowan sat alone in his quarters, the small metal desk lamp casting a weak circle of light across paperwork he pretended to read. His uniform jacket lay folded on the cot, untouched since he stripped it off hours earlier. His hands rested on his knees, fingers curled slightly, as if holding something unseen. The room smelled faintly of cleaning solution and dust. Everything was clean, precise, standard issue. Yet Blake felt as though the walls were pressing closer, demanding answers he wasn't ready to give. He replayed the moment in the courtyard again and again. Not the water, not the humiliation, but the look in the recruit's eyes when Cassandra endured him without breaking. They had not looked at him with admiration. They had looked at him with pity, not for her, for him. He exhaled slowly, closing his eyes for a moment, letting the weight settle. He had not joined the military for power. He had joined because his father once told him the service was where a man learned who he truly was. Somewhere along the way, the lesson had blurred. A sharp knock broke the quiet. He looked up. Enter. Corporal Hayes stepped in, her posture stiff. She did not make eye contact, but her voice carried the careful tone of someone trying not to be noticed by whatever storm was happening in the room. "Sergeant, Command Hall summons remains scheduled. 1900 hours, attendance mandatory." Blake nodded. Thank you. She hesitated at the doorway. Sergeant, for what it's worth, some of us thought you were better than that. The words were not spoken with malice, just disappointment. She left before he could form a reply. He sat in silence for a long moment, then rose, took his jacket, and put it on with deliberate care. Each button clicked into place like a decision being made, one after another. He took one last breath before stepping out into the hallway. The walk to Command Hall felt longer than usual. The corridor lights buzzed softly overhead, and soldiers moved aside as he approached, their faces neutral, but their eyes curious. Not accusatory, not respectful, something in between. When he entered the hall, Cassandra Vale was already there. The room was spacious, with a long central table surrounded by officers of varying ranks. Maps lined the walls. Reports and mission briefings lay stacked in neat piles. The air carried that quiet anticipation found only in military spaces where decisions reshaped futures. Cassandra stood at the head of the table, reviewing intelligence documents. Her uniform had dried, but her hair still held the soft wave of having once been soaked. She had not changed into something more formal. She did not need to. Her presence was enough. Blake took his place along the table. Several officers looked at him but said nothing. He felt their awareness, but not their judgment, not yet. Cassandra spoke without raising her voice. A humanitarian convoy has gone missing north of the strait. Last known contact was 12 hours ago. No distress signals, no radar signatures. It vanished without trace. She paused only long enough for the weight of the statement to settle. We believe enemy interference. Blake felt the shift in the room. This was not routine. This was the kind of situation where lives were suspended on decisions made in the next few hours. Cassandra continued, "We are deploying a search and stabilization unit at dawn. I will lead it." The officers stiffened. Admirals did not lead field missions, not anymore, but she was not an ordinary admiral. Blake felt something stir in his chest. Respect, yes, but also something deeper. Something like realization. She had not come here to command from a distance. She had come to restore something that had been forgotten. An officer across the table cleared his throat. "Admiral, respectfully, sending you into hostile uncertainty is a risk we are not obligated to take." Cassandra looked at him calmly. "The service is not built to protect comfort. It is built to protect lives." No one argued after that. Her gaze shifted slowly around the table, stopping finally on Blake. "Sergeant Rowan," she said quietly but undeniably, "you will accompany me." The room flickered with surprise, though no one dared speak it aloud. Blake felt the words settle like an anchor in his chest. To serve at her side meant scrutiny, responsibility, no room for arrogance, only integrity. He straightened. "Yes, Admiral." For the first time that day, Cassandra's eyes held something almost gentle. Not approval, not forgiveness, possibility, good, she said. The meeting continued with tactical planning, supply logistics, communication protocols. But Blake heard little of it. He was listening to something deeper, something silent within himself. When the briefing concluded, Cassandra remained behind, reviewing documents once more. Blake hesitated before approaching, unsure if he had the right to speak. She sensed him before he spoke. "You're troubled." He nodded. "I thought strength was something you earn by proving you can endure." She closed the folder gently. "Strength is not endurance." Her gaze lifted. "It is awareness, and the courage to choose differently when the world hands you the same pain it once used to shape you." He absorbed those words slowly, like water sinking into dry ground. "I don't know if I can be that," he admitted. Her expression did not change, not yet, "but you are capable of becoming it." The honesty in her voice left no room for self-deception. "Report to the flight deck at 0500, she said. He nodded and stepped away. For the first time in years he did not fear the morning. He anticipated it. The dawn air at Ravenford carried a cold clarity with it, the kind that wakes the senses before the mind has time to speak. Pale light stretched across the coast, touching the waves with a faint silver shimmer. The air smelled of salt, fuel, metal, and the quiet anticipation of a mission that mattered. Blake Rowan stood on the flight deck long before the others arrived. He had not slept much, not from worry, but from something unfamiliar, the feeling of standing at a turning point. The kind that comes not once in a lifetime, but only when a person finally sees who they have become, and who they still might be. He watched the sea as it breathed against the shoreline. He felt small in the best way, like the world was larger than the weight he had once tried to carry alone. The rhythmic steps of boots approached. Cassandra Vale stepped into the soft morning light with her equipment bag slung over her shoulder. No escort, no ceremony. She moved with the ease of someone who had lived more in silence than in applause. "Sergeant," she said. He straightened. "Admiral." There was no tension between them now, only recognition. The rest of the search unit arrived gradually, medics, pilots, engineers, all prepared, quiet, focused. The helicopter engines rumbled to life, vibrating the deck beneath their boots. Before boarding, Cassandra turned to the group. "We are not going into battle," she said. "We are going to find people who need us. Some may be frightened, some injured, some may not trust us. You will meet them as protectors, not conquerors. Your presence is a promise, not a threat." Her voice carried not command, but conviction, the kind that reshapes the hearts of those who hear it. They departed. The helicopter lifted, rising into cold morning wind. The base shrank beneath them, the coastline unfolding like a rough, ancient map. The sky deepened into open blue, and the hum of the engines filled the cabin with steady vibration. Blake sat across from Cassandra. She was reviewing the convoy's last known route, but her expression held that same quiet composure, the kind forged in places where fear is real but does not own you. After a while, she spoke, not lifting her eyes. "You've been carrying something heavy for years, something that shaped how you treated others." He didn't pretend not to understand. "I thought being hard would make me unbreakable." "And did it?" she asked. He looked out the window at the endless ocean below. "No, it just made me numb." She nodded once. "Numbness is not strength, Rowan. It is a wound disguised as armor." Her words did not hurt. They healed in the way truth sometimes can. The flight continued in silence, but it was no longer uncomfortable. It was reflective, shared, human. Hours passed before the convoy's remains were located, stranded along a rocky inlet where jagged cliffs met dark water. Their vehicles were damaged but intact. No signs of firefight, no enemy presence, only the empty echo of something gone wrong. The team descended and began sweeping the area. Blake moved with the others, but he remained alert, not with the wide vigilance of fear, but with the steady awareness of someone who understands his role now. He found them first, a group of civilians huddled in a sheltered cove, exhausted and dehydrated. Children held tightly to older relatives. Some sat in shocked silence. None had weapons. None posed threat. Blake approached slowly. No barking orders. No sharp gestures, just slow, grounded presence. "We're here to get you home," he said. A woman looked up at him, her eyes red from fatigue. She hesitated, then reached out for his hand. He helped her stand, and in that moment, Something inside him shifted in a way he could feel, like a knot he had carried for years quietly untying. The team worked for hours, medical aid was given, supplies distributed. The civilians were escorted back to the landing site with patience and care. No one rushed, no one shouted. Every movement was deliberate, human. Cassandra moved among them without ceremony. She knelt to speak to a crying child. She checked the pulse of a trembling elder. She lifted supplies with her own hands rather than ordering others to do it. Authority, in its truest form, served. When the last evacuee was safely aboard and the helicopter began its return flight, Blake sat beside Cassandra once more. This time, he did not feel smaller in her presence. He felt aligned with it. He spoke quietly, but with certainty. "I understand now. She didn't ask what he meant, but he said it anyway. Strength isn't what I thought it was. It isn't dominance. It's responsibility and restraint, and remembering who you are even when the world tries to harden you." Cassandra looked at him fully now. "There will always be pressure to become the worst version of yourself," she said. "But your strength is the part of you that refuses." The helicopter flew on, the ocean far below reflecting morning light like scattered silver glass. Ravenford Base came into view again, familiar yet somehow changed. Not because the base was different, because he was. When they landed and the others began to disembark, Blake paused. "Admiral," he said. "Thank you." She gave a slight nod. "Just don't forget who you chose to become today." "I won't." She stepped away toward the hangar. Blake remained on the deck for a moment longer, the wind pulling at his uniform, the world around him wide and open. For the first time in many years, he felt strong, but not because others feared him, because he no longer feared himself. And that is where change truly begins.